Welcome back, and joining us now is Roger Stone. Roger is the author of the book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. And Roger, welcome to the show, guy.
Great to be on the show.
Well, Roger, let's start off by, what is your background? I mean, what did you do prior to writing this book?
I'm a longtime political operative. I worked for President Richard Nixon. I worked for President Ronald Reagan. I worked for Senator Bob Dole. I'm a veteran of 8 national Republican presidential campaigns. About a year and a half ago, I joined the Libertarian Party because I came to the sad recognition that both parties are kind of morphed into one big government, big money, big spending, big debt, big war, big spying party. And that's another story. But so I had access to a number of the people who were in this drama. I knew and spent many hours with President Richard Nixon. I knew E. Howard Hunt, the CIA operative who was later a Watergate burglar, who's involved in this story. So I come from a political background, and I'm really not a conspiracy guy. In other words, I don't think flying saucers landed at Roswell, New Mexico, and I don't think the attack on America on 9/11 was an inside job. I'm a pretty, realistic, hard-bitten political realist, if you will. But it is just clear to me that Lyndon Baines Johnson had unique means, motive, and opportunity to kill John Kennedy. And I think that has been glossed over. But as the Latins say, cui prodest seclus est fict, the person who derives the greatest benefit from the crime is likely the person who committed it. And that happens to be the case here.
Okay, well, now what made you decide to write this book?
In 1964, I was a lowly preteen volunteer in the Goldwater campaign, and I read a book called The Texan Looks at Lyndon, and I was struck by how intrinsically evil this man. Lyndon Johnson is a man who was a crude, coarse, loudmouth bully. He was a sadist. He, as a boy, he tried to stick a dynamite to a stray dog and blew him up. Another time, he beat a mule to death in the town square where he lived in Texas. This is a man who was an amoral sociopath, somebody who was greedy, ruthless, ambitious, completely unprincipled, and more importantly than all of that, epically corrupt. I mean, corruption of biblical proportions. So I had him figured as a bad actor. And then, frankly, the Warren Commission never made sense to me. Their conclusions, appear to me that they made their decision first, what happened, and then they cut and paste the evidence to try to fit. And there were just too many questions about their conclusions. So I began to research Johnson's connections to the assassination, and this was a 30-year project. I mean, I've been collecting information for 30 years. It took me about 10 years on and off to write the book. But people forget that in November of 1963, Lyndon Johnson was looking at political oblivion. Not just political oblivion. He was looking at probably federal prosecution and jail. Johnson was jammed up in 2 enormous corruption scandals of the day. The Bobby Baker scandal. Baker was his right-hand man, his bag man, as it were. Secretary of the U.S. Senate had collected millions in bribes for Lyndon Johnson. And the Senate was investigating that. And then the U.S. Justice Department under Robert Kennedy was investigating Johnson's ties to Billy Sol Estes, who was a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer. And in fact, Robert Kennedy had given a dossier to Life magazine, Time Life magazine, and they had 9 full-time investigative reporters on the ground digging into Johnson. So Johnson knew that the cat was out of the bag December 1st. There was a cover issue of Life magazine plan that would expose his corruption and lead only to jail. So he was a desperate, desperate man. And I believe he plotted with others who had their own motives to kill John Kennedy.
What got you started down the Kennedy path? I mean, the LBJ path?
Well, because to me it's very obvious. It's been hiding in plain sight. I mean, Lyndon Johnson stops both federal investigations into him with his new power as president. and he is able to survive. He had two choices: become president himself, or go to jail. And he was a very proud man. He hated being embarrassed. But the fact that this happened in Dallas, the fact that it was Johnson who insisted that JFK go to Dallas, it was Johnson's right-hand man and protege, Governor John Connally, who was his administrative assistant and campaign manager, who insisted that they drive through Dealey Plaza. It is interesting to me that Connally and Johnson took no interest in the logistics or arrangements for JFK's visits to San Antonio and Houston on the 21st of November, but they had to micromanage every aspect of the trip in Dallas. That, to me, is kind of a tip-off. And then, of course, there's Johnson's, actions during the actual assassination. We know from photographic evidence that LBJ hit the deck in his car before the first shot was fired. As soon as his car makes the turn into Dealey Plaza, he's on the floor. And he's huddled around a little walkie-talkie listening. To me, that was a dead giveaway that he knew in advance what was going to happen. In my book, I named the gunman, and I point out that 6 witnesses saw a gunman closely associated with Lyndon Johnson in the minutes before the assassination in the window of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. And
that would not be Lee Harvey Oswald?
No. In fact, they have, this assassination museum today. They've made the 6th floor into an assassination museum. Have you seen that?
I have.
Yeah, well, it's exactly like it was then. Oswald's not there. The point I'm making is that I think Lee Harvey Oswald is on the 2nd floor. I think the actual shooter is a man named Malcolm Mac Wallace. Wallace leaves a 34-point match fingerprint on a cardboard box in the sniper's nest on the 6th floor. It's the only fingerprint other than Lee Harvey Oswald's that the police find, and 6 people see a man matching Wallace's description in the window prior to the assassination. One of them is decimated by our inspector. He just destroys the guy, and the other 5 are ignored. One witness, Richard Carr, not only saw a man meeting Malcolm Wallace's description, heavy-set, balding, horn-rimmed spectacles, in the window minutes before the second, he also saw him fleeing the building and jumping in a car. Interestingly enough, there are no less than 4 attempts on the life of Richard Carr, this witness, between 1963 and 1978. People try to shoot him. People try to bomb him. So I think Wallace is the killer. Wallace is somebody who is a convicted murderer. His ties to Johnson are unquestionable. Johnson has gotten him a series of political patronage jobs. So I'm not saying that there was only one shooter, but I am saying that Malcolm Wallace was at least one of the shooters. And it's very typical of Johnson to want to have his own shooter in the pool because he was, in fact, a control freak. I tie Johnson to at least 8 murders in Texas prior to JFK. Murders to cover up corruption, murders to cover up vote stealing and voter fraud. So murder was in his DNA. Lyndon Johnson could order a murder the way you and I would order a ham sandwich.
One of the theories that had always intrigued me was the Agent Hickey theory. I believe that was his name, where the guy had, I think, like either an M14 or an AR-15, and inadvertently pulled the trigger. I mean, I'm sure you looked at all these other theories.
Yeah, to a certain extent, I wonder whether they are put out there as disinformation to distract attention from some of the theories that make more sense. I mean, look, a couple months ago, I saw a theory by a guy who said that Jackie Kennedy had a Derringer and she did it. I mean, there's a lot of wacky ideas out there. I've tried to build a case based on the kind of evidence that would hold up in court. Eyewitnesses, fingerprints, motive very clearly. While some of these other theories, and it's a free country, people are entitled to think whatever they want and espouse whatever they want, but realistically, I think that you probably have multiple gunmen. I think there is a gunman on the so-called grassy knoll. The point here is, of course, that Johnson did not act alone, or Johnson and his people did not act alone. Johnson had a unique relationship with all of those entities interested in the replacement of John Kennedy, those being the CIA, those being organized crime, and, of course, Big Texas Oil. JFK had managed to cross every one of them, and they all had motive of their own, but they also each have a unique relationship with Lyndon Johnson himself. He is the chief appropriator and funder of the CIA while in the Senate and as vice president. He is on the committee that funds their secret black box budgets, which are tucked into the aerospace budget. He is a unique relationship with organized crime. The Carlos Marcello crime family pays him $55,000 a month to protect their illegal gambling operations in Texas. We know that as soon as Johnson becomes president, he terminates the wiretaps that on organized crime that Attorney General Robert Kennedy has put in place. And then, of course, there's Big Texas Oil. They were apoplectic because JFK was trying to repeal their tax breaks, was trying to repeal the oil depletion allowance, which would have cost the oil men hundreds of millions of dollars. And Johnson is the chief proponent for the oil depletion allowance. So I argue that he has a unique relationship with all of the others who have an integral interest in getting rid of JFK.
What would Oswald's role have been? Was he then just a patsy?
He is indeed a patsy. I think that Oswald's background as a communist is totally fabricated. That is, that they made a careful effort to depict the guy as a communist, but I think he is. I think we now know that he's an American intelligence asset. He has been trained in Nags Head, North Carolina, in this defector program. He has taught Russian in the Marines. At least 3 CIA officials who are now retired have confirmed that he was a CIA asset. Victor Marchetti, Robert Tosh Plumley, and Anthony Venciana. And then additionally, we know that when he went to New Orleans and he got arrested, Oswald got arrested for passing out anti-Castro flyers, and he gets into a fist fight, that when he's taken to the jail in New Orleans, he has one phone call. Who does he call? Does he call his wife? Does he call his lawyer? No, he calls the head of the FBI in New Orleans. And 55 minutes later, he's out of jail, and the charges are dropped. So neither the FBI nor the CIA were honest with the Warren Commission, and I think Oswald's on the second floor eating his lunch, just like he said he was. He is seen 90 seconds after the assassination in the lunchroom, and he's not out of breath. Those who say, "Oh, he ran down 4 flights of stairs," we now have a witness who was on the stairs, and they didn't see Lee Harvey Oswald. So no, I think he's set up as a fall guy.
Well, I do know that he himself maintained that he was a CIA asset, as you call it. I mean, that was one of the things that hadn't he always maintained?
Well, he also kept saying to his wife and to his mother, "Don't worry about this. My friends will take care of it." So he obviously thought that the agency was going to protect him. The truth is, voice stress analysis technology didn't exist in 1963. Tells us today that all of the things that were exculpatory that he said at the police station, such as, "I haven't shot anybody, I don't know what you're talking about." Reporter yells out, "Did you shoot the President of the United States?" He says, "No, sir, I did not." Those analyses show that he's telling the truth.
What about Officer Tippit?
Well, they could never match the bullet that killed Tippit to the gun that Oswald was carrying in the theater. I think that's curious. There's no explanation of the testimony in the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission by Oswald's landlady that while Oswald got to the boarding house, he goes to his room, and while he's in his room, a Dallas police car pulls up in front of the boarding house and beeps the horn 3 times. I find that curious. I'm not certain that Oswald killed Tippit. There's only one witness that says he did. I think that witness is unreliable. There are also other witnesses who Arlen Specter and the Warren Commission chose to ignore, who say that they saw 2 men. They saw a man who did not meet Oswald's physical description. So I am uncertain as to whether he killed Tippit. It is possible that in a panic, realizing he's going to be pinned with the blame for the murder of the President of the United States, that he kills Tippit to escape. Not inconceivable, but I am not certain.
What about his picture with the murder weapon?
Those in the researcher community say that was staged.
Well, I do remember years ago, perhaps around one of the other anniversaries, where they were showing that was a doctored photograph.
Yeah, I believe it's doctored. If you look at the shadow under his nose and then the shadow of the other items, they're off. The sun would be at a different trajectory. It looks to me like an obvious forgery. It's not the only forgery in this case. I mean, Linda, 13 doctors and nurses tell us at Parkland Hospital that JFK has a grapefruit-sized hole in the back of his head, and then when the government produces X-rays, they're pristine. Now, it's interesting to me that the Warren Commission never had X-rays or photos. They were given hand-drawn renderings of the president's wounds, which sounds rather suspicious to me in itself. And then many years later, X-rays surface, and the X-rays show the back of his head perfectly intact, totally contradictory to 13 different eyewitnesses. I'll take the eyewitnesses over the doctored photograph.
So you think
doctored X-ray?
You think LBJ's motive was simply to become president and squash these
survival?
Yeah, squash these investigations against him.
Yeah, I think his motive was survival, and he was a scrappy survivor, to say the least. I mean, Johnson, the man, is a coarse, crude, corrupt, loudmouth bully. I mean, he is ruthless. He is greedy. He is epically ambitious, and he's a pathological liar. Back in Texas, they call him Lion Linden. I think that he is uniquely positioned with each of these other entities to pull off a plot, and I think he had no choice. He was not going to go to prison.
Why would he have left Bobby in charge?
Well, Bobby's not in charge. Immediately, the deputy attorney general...
I meant with the attorney general.
Well, he leaves him with the title, but no real power. I mean, Nicholas de Katzenbach, the number 2 guy at the U.S. Attorney's, at the Justice Department, begins reporting directly to Johnson, at Johnson's orders. Bobby understands politics. He knows that he who controls the FBI, and he who controls the Dallas Police Department, and he who controls the Dallas County District Attorney, and he who controls the CIA will control the investigation and will control the prosecution. Remember that murder in 1963 is a state crime, not a federal crime. There's no statute against the murder of the president. Consequently, the Dallas Police, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, and the Dallas County District Attorney are going to investigate and prosecute the murder of John F. Kennedy. And they're all Johnson men. This is Johnson's political fiefdom. So Bobby understood the only way he could right this wrong was to get elected president himself. We know that he, in a speech in California shortly before his death, he said he planned to reopen the investigation into his brother's death. That had to send chills through the spines of the conspirators. I think it plays a factor in his own death. We also know that when Jackie Kennedy learned that Bobby was dead, she called Carter Burton in New York, a socialite friend of hers, and said, "They got Bobby too."
I remember that remark. Well, walk me through the case, if you don't mind. I mean, I know we don't want to steal people away from your book, but just walk me through it.
The case most simply is that Malcolm Mac Wallace is a University of Texas student who's recruited early by Lyndon Johnson. Wallace holds a series of political patronage jobs, the first one at the Agriculture Department. He's a very intelligent man. He's also a Marine marksman. In 1951, he murders a man named John Douglas Kinzer, who was involved with Johnson's sister. Johnson's sister was a flamboyant, bohemian, bisexual party girl, and sometimes prostitute at Miss Hattie's in Austin. She was an embarrassment to Johnson and an impediment to his political career, but she had been involved in helping him steal the 1948 Senate election. Anyway, Wallace kills Kinzer. Kinzer's trying to blackmail Johnson, demanding money from Johnson. Kinzer is murdered in cold blood by Malcolm Wallace. Malcolm Wallace is apprehended. When he's arrested, he says, "You can't arrest me. I have to get back to Washington. I work for Senator Johnson." But he is arrested. He goes on trial for first-degree murder. He is bailed out by two of Lyndon Johnson's biggest financial contributors. He is represented at trial by John Cofer, who's Lyndon Johnson's personal attorney. He is convicted of first-degree murder, whereupon he gets a 5-year suspended sentence. Now, I checked. Everybody else convicted of first-degree murder in Texas in 1952 went to the electric chair, except for Malcolm Wallace. He walked out of court a free man, where he immediately goes to work for a defense contractor called Temco, owned by a man named H.D. Byrd, an oil millionaire supporter of Lyndon Johnson's. H.D. Byrd also owns something called the Texas School Book Depository Building. So there's more than enough connections of Wallace to this trail of murder. Henry Marshall is an agriculture inspector general. He's investigating Lyndon Johnson and Billy Sol Estes. He is murdered with a bolt-action rifle. He shot 5 times. That's a rifle you have to reload each time. Any one of those shots would have killed him, but they call it a suicide. When Clint Peebles, the Texas Ranger, is investigating, he finds that a man who meets Wallace's description stopped at a gas station right outside Henry Wallace's ranch looking for directions to the Marshall place. Pardon me. So I think he is the killer. I think that he has killed Ford Johnson before. I think he is at least one of the shooters. Probably a shooter on the grassy knoll. Probably a shooter in the Dow Tex building next door. Very clearly, John F. Kennedy shot from the front and the back. The government goes to enormous gyrations to try to conceal that, including, as we discussed, fabricating X-rays and so on, coming up with the cockamamie single bullet theory. So, that in sum, Johnson has unique motive, means, and opportunity. The Secret Service that day, in my opinion, lays down on John Kennedy. They're supposed to seal the buildings on both sides of Dealey Plaza and empty them and seal them. They don't. There's supposed to be 6 motorcycle officers, 3 on either side of the car. There isn't. There's only 2, and they're told to ride behind the rear axle. There's supposed to be 2 agents on the rear bumper. There isn't. There's supposed to be 2 agents walking along the side of the car when it drops below 15. There isn't. I mean, we know that Lyndon Johnson secured the Secret Service Protection Manual in 1962, and we know that the president was properly protected in Houston and San Antonio the day before. All those things were in place, but in Dallas, he's a sitting duck. Maybe this explains why when Lyndon Johnson returns to Washington, the first man up the staircase on Air Force One, the man he gives a bear hug to is Secret Service Director James Rowley. It turns out that Rowley got his first job in politics in 1938 from Lyndon Johnson in the Roosevelt administration, in the youth administration. So, in sum, I think that Johnson yoked a conspiracy, was the linchpin of a conspiracy that, yes, involved the CIA, yes, involved the mob, yes, involved Texas Oil, but he was the indispensable man because he controlled Dallas.
So how did they pick Oswald to be their patsy?
Well, I think the CIA did that over a period of time. I mean, I think he was groomed for this. He was sent to, had these activities in New Orleans to establish that he was a communist. I think the CIA groomed him to be the fall guy. And if you look at the things that he says that day, he's clearly bewildered. When he's arrested, it's like, why are you doing this? What are you talking about? What is this all about? I still don't think he realizes until later that he has been set up to take the fall.
All right, what about Jack Ruby? What's the Ruby angle?
Well, the Warren Commission tells us Jack Ruby has no known associations with organized crime, which is absurd. I mean, Jack Ruby runs his strip club at the sufferance of the mob. He has run guns to Cuba for the mob, working specifically for Carlos Marcello. He's worked in Las Vegas for the mob. He has worked in Chicago for the mob. He is a low-level button man. He's not but his value to the mob is his relationship with individual members of the Dallas Police Department. He is a guy who entertains a lot of off-duty cops. He was well known around the police station. They explain why he was able to get access so easily. We also know that President Richard Nixon was in Dallas that day. He flies back to New York. He learns that the president's been shot. He goes to his apartment in Manhattan. He calls J. Edgar Hoover. He said, "Edgar, was it one of those right-wing kooks?" "No," Hoover says, "it was a communist." Well, Nixon believed that for 48 hours. He thought Oswald did it until he saw Jack Ruby blow away Oswald on national TV. Nixon jumps to his feet, turns white as a ghost, and says, "I know that guy." Fast forward to 1985, I learned that in 1947, Congressman Lyndon Johnson brought Jack Ruby to Congressman Richard Nixon and asked Nixon to put him on the payroll as a part-time informant as a courtesy. Now, I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years on both the Senate side and on the House side. I can tell you this kind of thing is done as a courtesy between members when there's leftover staff funds. They'll often put part-timers on as a courtesy to another member. But very clearly, Ruby was identified to Nixon in 47 as a Johnson man. I think it was at that point that Nixon figured out what was happening. This is why in the Watergate tapes you can hear him say that the Warren Commission is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated.
I was not aware of that. I remember, wasn't Gerald Ford part of the Warren Commission?
Yeah, Gerald Ford's activities are very, very curious. He's a congressman from Michigan at that time. He's appointed to the commission by LBJ. We find it in 1996 there are government documents declassified that show us that at the request of the FBI and suggestion of the FBI, that Gerald Ford, in his own handwriting, altered the autopsy records to move the description of a wound that was in Kennedy's upper left back, 3 inches from the third thoracic vertebrae, to his lower neck. And the reason he does this is to accommodate the government's single bullet theory. They now want to explain the wound on the front of Kennedy's throat, which was identified by 3 doctors at Parkland as an entry wound. They now want to reclassify that as an exit wound. Well, where's the entry? Ford had to move the evidence. When Ford is confronted about this by the New York Times, he said, well, the country needed clarity. You notice he doesn't say the country needed truth. I'm convinced, by the way, that this is why Nixon pardons Ford. Because if Nixon goes to trial in the Watergate matter, he's taken everybody down with him. He will lay out the CIA's involvement in the Kennedy assassination. He will lay out Gerald Ford's involvement in the cover-up. Ford essentially destroys his chances at re-election by pardoning Nixon. Costs him very badly, and it's why he loses re-election. But I think he had no choice. I think Nixon would have gone to trial and spilled the beans.
I have heard for all my life the CIA connection. So I guess what we're saying is that Ruby had a JFK LBJ connection. And
well, the CIA certainly has an LBJ connection through the 50s and his funding of them in the Senate. The mob has their own issues. The mob had given John Kennedy $1 million and helped steal votes for him in Illinois, Chicago, and West Virginia. $1 million in 1960 is an enormous amount of campaign money. And in return, Ambassador Joe Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, or a gangster himself, he promised the mob that the Eisenhower administration efforts to deport Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, 2 of the major gangsters of the day, would be stopped. Well, Bobby becomes Attorney General, and he speeds up the effort to deport Marcello and Trafficante, and he cracks down on a bunch of other mobsters. So the mob believes they have been double-crossed. They are furious because they have been double-crossed, and that's why I believe they play a role here. I think they likely provide one of the gunmen.
Can you tie all this together for me? I mean, how did the plot hatch? When did they get Ruby involved? When did they decide to set up Oswald as a patsy? Who was in charge of security that day?
I think it's 2 years. I think this is 2 years in the planning. It's very interesting to me that at the 1961 inauguration, January, very, very cold day in Washington, the day that John F. Kennedy is sworn in, the day that he gives his famous "Ask not what you can do for what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." When he gives that speech, Bobby Baker, Secretary of the Senate, Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man, says John Kennedy will not live out his term and he will die a violent death. I think this is 2 years in the planning. I think that it is a complicated plan, and people say to me, "Well, how can you accuse these august, respected men on the Warren Commission, of a cover-up that's treasonous? Why would they do that?" Well, if you listen to Lyndon Johnson's phone tapes, your answer can be found. He tells each member of the commission the same thing. Look, the Russians did this. It was done by the Russians and the Cubans. It was blowback from our attempts to assassinate Castro. If the American people learn this, we're looking at World War III. We're looking at nuclear Armageddon, millions dead. The American people will demand retaliation. So for the good of the country, Judge Warren, you have to head this commission and help me cover up the international aspect of this. There's no truth to that. There's no evidence whatsoever, but Johnson tells that lie over and over again in his attempt to get people to do what he wants regarding the cover-up. And, of course, J. Edgar Hoover has his own motives. He knows that the Kennedy brothers will retire him. He's facing mandatory retirement in 1964, and he has no interest in retiring. He's built an empire. He's very close to Lyndon Johnson. They're next-door neighbors in Northwest Washington. Johnson, once again, is taking care of all of Hoover's appropriations through the 50s. The size of the FBI almost triples from 1951 to 1961 in terms of dollars, courtesy of Lyndon Johnson. So when you're controlling the investigation, in essence, the government's investigating itself. It's like asking John Gotti to investigate a mob hit. There's intrinsic conflict of interest there.
Now, why would the CIA agree to go along with LBJ?
Well, because they're furious with Kennedy over his failure to order air support for the Cuban rebels at the Bay of Pigs. They are upset about the real outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We, the American citizens, don't learn for 30 years that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, John Kennedy has agreed to withdraw American missiles from Turkey and Italy, changing the balance of power in the Eastern Theater. We had strategically placed missiles there. That was classified. We didn't learn that for 30 years. But the Pentagon knew it, the CIA knew it, and they were very unhappy about it. So they think that despite the fact that John Kennedy in 1960 ran to the right of Nixon, criticizing Nixon for not being aggressive enough about removing Castro, criticizing the Eisenhower administration for allowing a missile gap, allowing our defenses to fall behind the Soviets. That's a wink to the defense contractors. Kennedy runs as a hard-line Cold Warrior in 1960, and when he gets to office, they believe, the military-industrial complex, if you will, that he's moving left. That he is. They know that he has reached out to Castro through back channels to try to open discussions. He reaches out to Castro through William Atwood, and who's an ambassador and a college roommate of JFK's at Princeton. He has reached out to Castro through a French journalist who's a friend of Jackie Kennedy's. He thinks the CIA doesn't know about this, but they do because they're most likely listening to his phone calls. They have plenty of motive. The mob's motive we've discussed, and then the oil depletion. The oil guys are upset because their tax break is going to be repealed by JFK.
Well, there were also reports that JFK was going to pull out of Vietnam, that LBJ wasn't happy about that. There was supposedly some big announcement that was about some big major development as it related to the Federal Reserve. I mean, did any of that play any role in it?
Yeah, I think those are all factors. In other words, there is some evidence that John Kennedy had figured out that Vietnam was going to be a disaster. He had signed an executive order to remove the first troops. There is some evidence that there was a plan to have all of our troops out of Vietnam by 1965. He was making monetary changes that upset the central bank and upset the central bankers. I think he, in a very short period of time, he engendered some very, very powerful and very deadly enemies. I think all of these things play a factor. I don't think that Johnson acts alone. It is interesting that Johnson reverses Kennedy's Vietnam policy immediately the following Monday.
Also,
he rescinds the executive order.
And then also Kennedy's executive order 11110, which was basically resurrecting the U.S. note backed by silver, which would have, I'm sure, gotten the central bankers' panties in a wad, that as soon as LBJ took office, those notes disappeared from circulation.
Exactly, which is why I think the central bank does play some role here. The bankers do play some role. I think there's a distinctive difference between those, of course, who have knowledge of what's going to happen and those who are centrally involved. I'll give you a perfect example. I was very close to Ambassador John Davis Lodge. He was the U.S. ambassador to Spain, Argentina, and Switzerland. He was the brother of Henry Cabot Lodge, who was JFK's ambassador to Vietnam. John Lodge told me that his brother was called to Washington to meet with the president on the 23rd, ostensibly to be fired. But he wasn't worried about it because he knew that JFK wasn't coming back from Dallas. Classic example of an establishment figure knowing what's going to happen but not being centrally involved in the planning of it.
Okay, so LBJ is about to be arrested or go down because of these numerous scandals.
Yes.
The CIA is upset because they think that Kennedy's gone lefty.
Yep.
All right, so somewhere these two groups, LBJ and his group of thugs, and the CIA get together and they come up with the plot to kill Kennedy. Am I understanding this correctly now?
I think that's probably right, although I don't think we can discount the organized crime's role. Remember, the CIA and organized crime are partners beginning in 1958 in an effort to assassinate Fidel Castro. Interestingly enough, a plan that was approved by Vice President Richard Nixon. The reason that the CIA needs the mob guys is because when Castro takes power in Cuba, he expels all the CIA assets. Cuban intelligence can identify our agents, and they throw them out of the country or they arrest them. So they need human intelligence in Cuba, and the organized crime people, of course, own hotel, casino, resorts there, still have people inside the country, mid-level and low-level people. So there's a nexus between organized crime and the CIA that I think carries over to this plot. I believe that Ed Clark, who was a Texas attorney and really Johnson's main operative, is probably the overall planner and executor of the plot. I think a lot of people are involved but don't know why they're involved. So, for example, when John Connally, the governor of Texas, insists that JFK drive through Dealey Plaza, a route that the Kennedy staff resisted right to the end until they were overruled. I don't think Connally knows why he's been told to do that by Johnson. He's just been told to do it, and he does it. And Connally, of course, is famously in the death car and is wounded in the attack on John Kennedy. But as I outline in my book, the morning of the 22nd, Lyndon Johnson goes to John Kennedy and tries to convince him to let Connally ride in the vice president's car with Johnson and to put Senator Ralph Yarborough, an arch enemy of Johnson's, into President Kennedy's car. Kennedy refuses. The two men have a shouting match, and Johnson storms out of the room. So I think there are those who were involved but may not have had knowledge of why they were following Johnson's orders. Many, many years later, when asked whose idea it was for the Kennedy to go to Dallas and for Kennedy to drive through Dealey Plaza, John Connolly in an oral history says it was Lyndon's idea. He was being a real a-hole about it.
We're speaking with Roger Stone. Roger is the author of the book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. Roger, this is fascinating stuff. I'm going to need to read this book thoroughly and call you back. How's that?
I would love that.
Once again, this is Roger Stone. The name of the book is The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. Roger, thank you for your time today.
Many, many thanks.
All right, you too.